When should you shoot a cop? That question, even without an answer, makes most law-abiding taxpayers go into knee-jerk conniptions. The indoctrinated masses all race to see who can be first and loudest to proclaim that it is never okay to forcibly resist law enforcement. In doing so, they also inadvertently demonstrate why so much of human history has been plagued by tyranny and oppression. In an ideal world, cops would do nothing except protect people from thieves and attackers, in which case shooting a cop would never be justified. In the real world, however, far more injustice, violence, torture, theft, and outright murder has been committed in the name of law enforcement than has been committed in spite of it. To get a little perspective, try watching a documentary or two about some of the atrocities committed by the regimes of Stalin or Lenin or Chairman Mao or Hitler or Pol Pot or any number of other tyrants in history. Pause the film when the jackboots are just about to herd innocent people into the cattle cars or just about to gun them down as they stand on the edge of a ditch, and then ask yourself the question, when should you shoot a cop? Keep in mind, the evils of those regimes were committed in the name of law. And as much as the statement may make people cringe, the history of the human race would have been a lot less gruesome if there had been a lot more cop killers around to deal with the state mercenaries of those regimes. Now, people don't mind when you point out the tyranny that has happened in other countries, but most have a hard time viewing their own country, their own government, and their own law enforcers in any sort of objective way. Having been trained to feel a blind loyalty to the ruling class of the particular piece of dirt they live on, also known as patriotism, and having been trained to believe that obedience is a virtue, the idea of forcibly resisting law enforcement is simply unthinkable to many. Literally, they can't even think about it. And humanity has suffered horribly because of it. It is a testament to the effectiveness of authoritarian indoctrination that literally billions of people throughout history have begged and screamed and cried in the face of authoritarian injustice and oppression, but only a tiny fraction have ever actually lifted a finger to try to stop it. Even when people can recognize tyranny and oppression, they still usually talk about working within the system, the same system that's responsible for the tyranny and the oppression. People want to believe that the system will, sooner or later, provide justice. The last thing they want to consider is that they should illegally resist, that if they want to achieve justice, they must become criminals and terrorists, which is what anyone who resists legal injustice is automatically labeled. But history shows all too well that those who fight for freedom and justice almost always do so illegally, i.e., without the permission of the ruling class. If politicians think that they have the right to impose any law they want, and cops have the attitude that as long as it's called law, they will enforce it, what is there to prevent complete tyranny? Not the consciences of the lawmakers or their hired thugs, obviously, and not any election or petition to the politicians. When tyrants define what counts as law, then by definition, it is up to the lawbreakers to combat tyranny. Pick any example of abuse of power, whether it's the fascist so-called war on drugs, the police thuggery that has become so common, the random stops and searches now routinely carried out in the name of security, such as at airports, border checkpoints that aren't even at the border, sobriety checkpoints, and so on, or any other example. Now ask yourself the uncomfortable question. If it's wrong for cops to do these things, doesn't that imply that the people have a right to resist such actions? And of course, state mercenaries don't take kindly to being resisted, even non-violently. If you question their right to detain you, interrogate you, search you, invade your home, and so on, you are very likely to be tasered, physically assaulted, kidnapped, put in a cage, or shot. If a cop decides to treat you like livestock, whether he does it legally or not, you will usually have only two options: submit or kill the cop. You can't resist a cop just a little and get away with it. He will always call in more of his fellow gang members until you are subdued or dead. Basic logic dictates that you either have an obligation to let law enforcers have their way with you, or you have the right to stop them from doing so, which will almost always require killing them. Politely asking fascists to not be fascists has a very poor track record throughout history. Consider the recent Indiana Supreme Court ruling, which declared that if a cop tries to illegally enter your home, it's against the law for you to do anything to stop him. Aside from the patent absurdity of it, since it amounts to giving thugs with badges permission to break the law and makes it a crime for you to defend yourself against a criminal, if he has a badge, consider the logical ramifications of that attitude. There were once some words written on a piece of parchment, those words now known as the Fourth Amendment, that said that you have the right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures at the hands of government agents. In Indiana today, what could that possibly mean? The message from the ruling class is quite clear and utterly insane. It amounts to this: we don't have the right to invade your home without probable cause, but if we do, you have no right to stop us, and we have the right to arrest you if you try. Why not apply that to the rest of the Bill of Rights while we're at it? You have the right to say what you want, but if we use violence to shut you up, you have to let us. I can personally attest to the fact that that is the attitude of the U.S. so-called Department of Justice. Or maybe, you have the right to have guns, but if we try to forcibly and illegally disarm you and you resist, we have the right to kill you. Ask Randy Weaver or the Branch Davidians about that one. You have the right to not testify against yourself, but when we coerce you into confessing and call it a plea agreement, you can't do a thing about it. What good is a right? What does the term right even mean if you have an obligation to allow jackboots to violate your so-called rights? It makes the term absolutely meaningless. To be blunt, if you have the right to do A, it means that if someone tries to stop you from doing A, even if he has a badge and a politician's scribble, sometimes called law, on his side, you have the right to use whatever amount of force is necessary to resist that person. That's what it means to have an unalienable right. If you have the unalienable right to speak your mind, a la the First Amendment, then if all else fails, you have the right to kill government agents who try to shut you up. If you have the unalienable right to be armed, then if all else fails, you have the right to kill government agents who try to disarm you. If you have the right to not be subjected to unreasonable searches and seizures, then if all else fails, you have the right to kill government agents who try to inflict those upon you. Those who are proud to be law-abiding don't like to hear this and don't like to think about this, but what's the alternative? If you do not have the right to forcibly resist so-called legal injustice, that logically implies that you have an obligation to allow government agents to do absolutely anything they want to you, your home, your family, your neighbors, and so on. Really, there are only two choices. You are a slave, the property of the politicians without any rights at all, or you have the right to violently resist government attempts to oppress you. There can be no other option. Of course, on a practical level, openly resisting the gang called government is usually very hazardous to one's health. But there's a big difference between obeying for the sake of self-preservation, which is often necessary and rational, and feeling a moral obligation to go along with whatever the ruling class wants to do to you, which is pathetic and insane. Most of the incomprehensible atrocities that have occurred throughout history were due in large part to the fact that most people answer never to the question of when should you shoot a cop. The correct answer is, when evil is legal, become a criminal. When oppression is enacted as law, become a lawbreaker. And when those violently victimizing the innocent have badges, become a cop killer. So the next time you hear of a police officer being killed in the line of duty, take a moment to consider the very real possibility that maybe in that case, the law enforcer was the bad guy and the cop killer was the good guy. As it happens, that has been the case more often than not throughout human history.
This shit's about to get real! Here we go again, I will never know.
Do some individuals wearing badges brutalize others? Are peaceful people being maced, tasered, kidnapped and caged, and in some cases murdered? Yes. If you visit copblock.org, you'll see that these incidents, unfortunate as they are, aren't isolated. This institutionalized violence is caused by the belief in a bad idea, that a group of people, most of whom you'll never meet, have the right to run your life because you're supposedly not competent to do so yourself. The institution, by its very existence, violates its stated objectives and can never succeed due to the lack of market signals. When any good, be it shoes or food or policing, is provided by a monopoly, it is doomed to fail. Put simply, police as currently structured lack the proper incentives. Yes, like you or I, police employees are individually responsible for their actions, and their misdeeds should be made transparent to help get accountability. But if one really wants to end police brutality, one must realize that at its core, it's the institution itself that must change. That is the linchpin. Thanks to decades of propaganda from government schools and the mainstream media, a lot of people, myself included once upon a time, unthinkingly have bought into that idea. I realize my previous statements may be a bit esoteric for some, so let me give an example. If you were an entrepreneur who manufactured and sold umbrellas, you could consider a number of measurable, objective factors to gauge your success. A comparison of sales from quarter to quarter, the output of your factory, or the percent of umbrellas that were returned defective. Yet any such metric is absent from policing today, as provision of the goods said to be supplied, security and safety, is done so via a monopoly sheltered from competition. You, selling umbrellas, depend on consensual interactions, whereas police today rely on coercive interactions. If you, as the umbrella entrepreneur, identify an employee as underperforming or hostile to colleagues or customers, you could fire them, thus improving output, workplace morale, and customer service. That ability is noticeably void from policing, since the customers claimed are told to pay for the service provided or else, something only compounded by the politicking of police unions. In fact, about the only thing measurable the monopoly of policing can cite is the increased number of enforcers on the payroll or actions said to now be illegal, both of which make more likely an increase in the size and scope of their agency. Such perverse incentives mean that policing, as currently structured, will always become more repressive, so that actions like writing with children's chalk, selling raw milk, or collecting rainwater are now said to be criminal. Text written by a person you've never met does not obligate you, so why pay criminals and their demands any attention? A civilian review board is but a band-aid that only makes the situation more convoluted. Replacing a current leader with one believed to be better still leaves intact the flawed institution. Reforming legislation, words on paper that some conflate to be law, fails to change the status quo, since legitimacy is still granted to a monopolistic group who claim the sole right and ability to create and interpret actions permissible. If you believe your local police corrupt or heavy-handed, what real incentive do they have to change? Sure, a couple token scapegoats from the department may be pointed to, but at the end of the day, the same failed institution that allowed for such misdeeds is present. To really bring about a better reality, one must consider alternatives. Some may point out that there are violent people who don't wear badges. Yes, that's unfortunately true as well. But the striking difference is that police employees claim, and currently are granted by many, a legitimate right to initiate force, whereas the common criminal is not. As Lysander Spooner succinctly pointed out 140 years ago, the highwayman takes solely upon himself the responsibility, danger, and crime of his own act. He does not pretend that he has any rightful claim to your money or that he intends to use it for your own benefit. He does not pretend to be anything but a robber. He does not persist in following you on the road against your will, assuming to be your rightful sovereign on account of the protection he affords you. He does not keep protecting you by commanding you to bow down and serve him, by requiring you to do this and forbidding you to do that, by robbing you of more money as often as he finds it for his interest or pleasure to do so, and by branding you as a rebel, a traitor, and an enemy to your country, and shooting you down without mercy if you dispute his authority or resist his demands. In short, he does not, in addition to robbing you, attempt to make you either his dupe or his slave. Think about it. Your local police claim to serve and protect you, but they first steal from you and everyone else who happens to live within that arbitrary political boundary. If a police employee claims to maintain order, yet also claims to be exempt of personal responsibility of their actions due to legalese created by his friends, such as acting under the color of law or immunity, it doesn't create for a good situation. It is that institutionalized, legitimate violence that through the course of human history has by far been the most devastating to human flourishing, what one researcher has coined democide. When you're driving your car and see in your rearview mirror a police cruiser, how do you feel? Anxious? Nervous? It's pretty telling that the presence of an individual who purports to keep you safe and whom steals your money for such a service causes such a reaction. Again, it comes down to incentives. If something is wrong for you or me to do, it can't suddenly become right when done by someone wearing a badge. One's level of culpability is not contingent on one's place of employment. By replacing support of the bad idea that allows for the police state with one that applies the same standards to all, we can create a better world in which to live, both for ourselves and for future generations. I'd guess most people, be they current police employees, cop blockers, or those relatively apathetic, would prefer to live in a safe, prosperous, dynamic society. That's a desirable end. Yet buying into the claim that certain people have a legitimate right to initiate force can only bring about the polar opposite. Perhaps then it's time to consider another means. Let me pose to you a question. Who owns you? If you don't believe yourself a slave, you would rightly conclude that you own yourself. With that self-ownership comes self-government, 100% freedom coupled with 100% responsibility. Real change won't come through a revolution, whether done at the ballot box or through the cartridge box, but through an evolution, one mind at a time. A revolution, no matter the form it takes, is still couched at its hub on a bad idea, that a person or small group supposedly have the authority to regulate every aspect of your life. An evolution, on the other hand, moves past that tired idea to one where you're free to act, to pursue your happiness while respecting others to do the same, where if you harm someone or their property, you make right, where reputation is key. Most folks are good, yet for the few who aren't, by making transparent their actions, it's more likely they'll be held accountable, which also means the extent of the harm they cause is mitigated more swiftly. That's why I choose to be involved with Cop Block. The message is consistent and peaceful, and it's decentralized and effective. In stark contrast to the provision of law enforcement today, in which a person atop a monopolistic hierarchy claims the ability to know best how to supply the quality and quantity of safety, cop blockers and friends work from the bottom up and collaborate horizontally, which means an infinite number of tactics can be pursued to bring about accountability and to erode the bad idea on which the police state today is based, ultimately bringing about the world in which we want to live. This message isn't anti-cop. In fact, I encourage current law enforcement employees to join us. If you do provide a good service, then your skills and knowledge will be in demand. The difference will be that it'll be supplied via consensual interactions, not coercive interactions. We can change things for the better, each of us, one mind at a time. I encourage you to think for yourself. Think, then act, not based on some artificial framework thrust upon you, but aligned with your own conscience. Thanks for your time.